Robert Rodriguez. Sometimes I think he is the best filmmaker with a small budget and one of the worst with a large one. I have a love-hate relationship with this director, probably more so than any other one. He has been responsible for some of my favorite films, and while I can't say he's also responsible for some of the worst I've ever seen, I can definitely say he's provided me some of my most cinematic letdowns, and the subject of this video is one of them. Granted, this guy has made a bunch of movies along with the Book of Boba Fett TV show, and I've only seen a handful of them, so admittedly, my take on Mr. Rodriguez is not the most objective one. But I feel I have seen enough of his work to defend my stance. And this is my damn channel. And it's a comedy channel. And I know I'm funny because my mommy told me so. Also, he's done a number of kids' movies, which I don't take into consideration for the sake of this video. That being said, anyone familiar with Shark Boy and Lava Girl will understand some of the over-the-topness with this director that will be a theme here. Rodriguez first came to my attention with the film Desperado, which I consider one of the best small-budget action films ever made. And I think it is one of the first times American audiences became familiar with Antonio Banderas and the bathwater drinkableness that is Salma Hayek. Since then, I found the films of him I have seen to be hit or miss, ranging from the superb ones like Sin City to overall disappointments like Once Upon a Time in Mexico. Now, regardless of my opinions on some of his cinematic presentations, I do think he is a true legend of the industry. This man is the ultimate success story of indie filmmaking. He has his own production studio, sound sets, and has pretty much done everything on his own, and has even created his own TV network, and I have tons of respect for him as a creator. Also, he has adopted a Quentin Tarantino, who will be a major figure in this video, and Kevin Smith's style of using the same actors that creates a canon-like nature to some of the movies that make you feel like they exist in parallel universes. That being said, I feel he's been such a successful indie filmmaker that he rarely has ever had to temper any of his ideas based on external influences. And at times, some of his work can sacrifice the plot and story arc for the coolness of the visual presentation. This is similar to what I understand of George Lucas with Star Wars, who needed other people as a counterbalance to even out some of his more ambitious but not so great ideas. This does come with the caveat that many of Rodriguez's films are directed by him but written by someone else. So understand, I realize that some of my comments do need to come with that grain of salt. This brings me to the topic of this bit of cinematic snarkiness, the film From Dusk Till Dawn. A movie that kind of has the effect of turning the viewer into the mark of a 3-card monte game. Google it, you fetuses. I compare it to 3-card monte because if you watch this film with absolutely no idea regarding what it's about, there will be a point where you're going to say, what in the actual fuck is going on? Not in an absolutely terrible way, but a real one, because this movie flips on you like a light switch. In an effort to portray the best I can the tempo and mood change that happens in this film, I'm gonna forgo any quick 1 or 2 sentence plot summary and dive directly into the cliff notes and my thoughts therein. The film opens in some gas station / liquor store in Nowheresville, Texas, with a sheriff and a station attendant shooting the shit about getting food poisoned by some mental invalid working the grill at some greasy spoon, when the conversation pivots to a nearby bank robbery where a number of people were killed. The sheriff mentions the culprits are possibly headed this way and that he's itching to give them the Dirty Harry Magnum Force treatment. The sheriff then goes to take a leak, and that is when from behind a case of coolers, we see one of the robbers played by George Clooney appear with a hostage in one hand and a revolver in the other pointed at the store attendant, followed by the other robber played by Quentin Tarantino, also holding a gun with a hostage. Clooney tells the attendant to get the sheriff out of here as soon as he gets out of the pisser, when Tarantino whispers to him that the attendant was signaling the cop. The attendant denies all of this, saying he's just scared, and Clooney reiterates to get this cop out of the store. The sheriff comes back in from the John to pay for a bottle of liquor when we see Tarantino go up to the cop and shoot him in the back of the head. Clooney asks why the fuck he did that. Tarantino says the attendant mouthed, "Help me," The attendant says that's bullshit, and Tarantino then shoots the attendant. Clooney goes off on Tarantino, telling him to start the car. And while this is happening, we see the attendant, who is not dead, get a pistol from a safe behind the counter and gets up firing, hitting Tarantino in the hand. Clooney fires back, and to sum up the rest of the scene, they set the attendant on fire by shooting up the liquor bottles behind the counter and tossing a flaming roll of toilet paper. The two crooks begin to leave the store, but not before the attendant, covered in flames, hops back up trying to shoot the two. Because, when you're on fire, your first instinct isn't to put out the flame, but to get them two son bitches that did this to you. Needless to say, the crooks riddle him with bullets, then exit the building, arguing with each other as it blows up. This is followed by the opening credits and a scene of the two driving down a desert road. Clooney downs some pills, chased by some booze. Tarantino wraps his injured hand with duct tape, and we are provided by a shot of a woman bound up in the trunk. I took the time to describe the opening of this movie in such detail because I need to express the mood of what you think this film is going to be. From Dusk Till Dawn grabs you by the balls from the beginning, even after repeated watches. This is a methed up version of any action or crime flick you've seen up to this point. In a previous video, I said The Crow was 90s liquefied in a bottle. Well, From Dusk Till Dawn is its cousin that's been in and out of the joint since they were 15 for various felonious assault charges. Getting back to the plot, we learned that our quote-unquote protagonists are named Richard and Seth Gecko. They are headed to this place in Mexico named El Rey that harbors fugitives for a cut of their ill-gotten gains. The two brothers just have to get across the border and rendezvous with their contact, which, after a bank robbery that's made the news, a number of killings and a kidnapping, is obviously easier said than done. And how do they go about getting into Mexico? The way you would expect from two law-abiding citizens of upstanding moral virtue, by hijacking an RV driven by an ex-pastor played by Harvey Keitel and his two children. Duh! Regarding our main cast of characters, I have to say it's a bit of a mixed bag. The older brother-younger brother dynamic of the Geckos is on display, with Richard being the relatively more level-headed of the two and is constantly berating Seth, who is clearly the more violent of the brothers and a known, how do I put this, grape jelly enthusiast. The creepiness of Quentin's character is something that I'm not sure would fly nowadays. As a matter of fact, this whole flick is a testament to shit that in our current world will never be reproduced. Is it the 30s and 40s Looney Tunes? No, but this movie is a real relic of a time when violence was a legitimate cinematic element, and that sensibility will never likely fucking return outside of rarities like Deadpool and Wolverine. But I digress. Harvey Keitel's performance is solid, and personally I think his explanation of why as a pastor he lost his faith is truly epic. Keitel's two kids, however, are where things fall off. Juliette Lewis is a bit wasted as her acting is as good as it is in any other film. There's just not much to her character outside of being a momentary vehicle to expand on the creepiness of Quentin's role. And the other one could honestly be replaced by a paper bag with the words Asian guy written on it. Getting back to the story. So the group successfully crosses the border into Mexico and eventually makes it to the rendezvous point, an all-night strip club named the Titty Twister. And we are once again briefly reminded of the viciousness of the two Gecko brothers, which in a few minutes will come back and somewhat literally bite them in the ass. At this point in the film, if this is your first viewing, you may find yourself wondering where it goes from here. I mean, you've got two killers and their hostages sitting in a nudie bar, so... And just when you're getting settled into the edginess and total no fucks given of this film, it backslides into a B-horror flick. Real fast, with Selma Hayek's uber fine ass being the hypnotic point of no return, because this is now a vampire movie. See, apparently this strip club is a den full of blood-sucking monsters who then start to massacre and feast on all the unsuspecting patrons, with Tarantino's character ironically being the first one to fuck around and find out. What happens next is fairly predictable, with our main cast minus one Gecko brother and the rest of the patrons that were not instantly killed fighting off the initial vampires, then the ones that were just turned after being attacked. Then one by one, all those survivors falling to the vampires, till all we're left with is Clooney and Lewis's characters barely surviving. The end. I really wish I had more to say about the culmination and ending of From Dusk Till Dawn, but I don't. Yes, the visual effects are impressive. The cinematography is still on point, as well as the dialogue for the most part, because those are the things I think Rodriguez excels at. The problem is that what you're watching seems like two different movies with the exact same cast were both cut in half, and the beginning of one and the ending of the other were Frankenstein together. And because of the raw nature of the first half compared to the relative campiness of the second, I get this bait and switch feel, and as a whole, it's really anticlimactic. How anticlimactic, you ask? Imagine going to a massage parlor called Hug and Tugs, expecting a happy ending, only to walk in and realize it's a legitimate business. That being said, the twist is in the title, so you can't get that mad like you were just bamboozled, but the overall split of the film is why I've always had a bone to pick with it. What I now recognize is the WWE over-the-top nature of the second half is so much more predictable than I realized after going back and rewatching this after a number of years. And I do now appreciate how the over-the-topness can be a positive thing, as there is a what the fuck element to this that reminds me of when I started getting into Adult Swim. But to quote my Crow video, the dumb fuckery quickly slaps me back into reality. Because a lot of this movie is just crazy shit stacked up on top of more crazy shit. And it keeps upping the ante at the cost of the story, until you realize there's not really much of one. And that's a shame considering the overall quality of the ensemble and the cinematography. It's like all the elements of a good sandwich, except there's small chunks of shit in the mayonnaise. Which is the rating I'm giving this movie. The beginning of this video covers my thoughts on Rodriguez as a filmmaker. And before the comment section vomits up a bunch of, hey asshole, Quentin Tarantino co-wrote this, so why aren't you talking shit about him too? You would be right to call out this is not entirely the creation of Mr. Rodriguez. And my retort would be that very fact proves my point, that my biggest gripe with him is that when unreined, more than a couple of the films I have seen from him tend to fly off the rails, especially with a large budget. Because I theorize that Rodriguez had the original idea for From Dusk Till Dawn, and Tarantino was the one that provided the grounding this film needed to be palatable. Hey, editing Tyler here. After some further research, I learned that a Robert Kurtzman conceived the idea From Dusk Till Dawn in 1988. Quentin Tarantino was hired to write the script as his first paid writing assignment, and after Pulp Fiction, Rodriguez was given the role of director. So my bad about the inaccuracies. That being said, the initial Google page does show Rodriguez and Tarantino as writing the screenplay, so that's where that comes from. And if you're familiar with the work of these two, watching From Dusk Till Dawn in retrospect can turn into a game of what elements are exactly the separate creative results of each person. That is, if you don't go back and think about Grindhouse, which in my opinion sheds a light on the variances between these two directors. Grindhouse's first half, Planet Terror, is Rodriguez on his typical over-the-top shit. Granted, Old Girl with the Blower for a Prosthetic Leg is a sight to behold. And the mock trailer skit for Machete is eerily intriguing within our current cultural climate. Just watch it because I ain't saying shit else about that. But the second half is Tarantino giving something that, while is much slower and arguably more boring in terms of the initial setup, I must say as a whole, Death Proof does a better job at presentation and payoff. And that is the fundamental difference. Tarantino is better at doing more with less in terms of action, writes arguably better dialogue, and is more consistent with that in spite of many of his projects being somewhat similar. And while I have a real respect for Rodriguez and his commitment to campiness, I feel he focuses so much on hyper-real storytelling that the result becomes overall higher peaks and valleys. On a final note, after a number of conversations with others, I've come to the realization that I lack the ability to just shut my brain the fuck off when watching a flick. I've been told that I can't sit back and just appreciate something because it's cool, or I tend to overanalyze films. And I must admit that's true, but I don't really think that's a bad thing. All that really means is that if I like a film, I have to be able to ignore its flaws, which is what pretty much any film viewer has to do. But I also think that anyone that truly enjoys film should have a similar critical approach, whether it's reviewers like myself or Mr. Johnny and Jane who gives a shit who just wants something to do after dinner. Because I honestly think if more of us did, it would affect our viewing and, more importantly, spending decisions. And that just might force Hollywood to stop shoveling out crap that makes even cancer seem more entertaining.